Good morning.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another Dignified Learning webinar. We're so glad to have you as our audience today for a really important topic that at Dignified Learning we love to talk about.
We're talking about accessibility today, which is often an overlooked topic when you're talking about adult learners.
The training is painful, but learning is joyful, something that we like to say at Dignified Learning. And we hope you find a little bit of joy in the content that we're sharing with you today.
We do have a free resource, as always, at the end of our webinar. We'll talk through how to get that, but keep in mind that we have 6 pillars of a dignified learning experience, and accessibility is one of those pillars. And this freebie at the end is accessible to you, and we'll walk you through how to process through whether or not your training that you're providing has the accessibility features your learners need.
So Emily, I just have to ask, when we think about accessibility, especially in the context of e-learning, what comes to mind?
Well, I would take it one step back and just say what comes to mind when you think of accessibility. And I think part of the image that comes into most individuals' minds is that image of the wheelchair, right? And that's the result of a lot of really important work that has been done to raise awareness for physical disabilities. And when you're talking about e-learning, physical disabilities might not be the most, common topic that you're going to dive into, but we're going to talk about what does accessibility mean when you're in the context of e-learning.
Absolutely. So commonly known disabilities are visible disabilities. And as Emily had just talked about, there's a symbol that we see out in the world quite often using the wheelchair. We think of, vision loss, hearing loss, and physical accessibility challenges that people are living with.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And while those are really important, we're going to talk about the ones that are often overlooked when you're talking about e-learning. So visible disabilities, if that's the only thing that you're really considering, you're missing out and you have a huge blind spot. And today we're just really trying to raise some awareness and give some food for thought about things that you can consider that are tangible, that you can keep in mind as you are providing e-learning experiences. So we just have some statistics to share with you today. So when we talk about invisible disabilities, when we do research, about 10% of individuals in the United States across all age groups have some type of invisible disability. And I would put an asterisk next to that and say that they are invisible, and we haven't always kept track of the various forms of invisible disability. So this could very well be an underestimate, and it could be much more prevalent depending on what age group, what demographic, what area of the country you're talking about.
So Emily, does it, as an employer or as someone who's responsible for training, is it necessary to know when someone has an invisible disability, or should we kind of always be creating training with that in mind?
You always need to be creating training with accessibility in mind. And you may know that an individual has an invisible disability, but in most circumstances you will not. And the individual learner who has perhaps an invisible disability might not even be aware of it themselves.
So at Dignified Learning, another pillar is respect. And it really sounds like we're tying the two together here, that we're creating training that respects learners that are living with disabilities, making it accessible for everybody, even though you may not know exactly who has a disability.
Right, and we're going to talk about this, but accessibility doesn't even necessarily have to have a disability associated with it, right? Accessibility is really about removing barriers to learning. And when you're talking about, invisible disabilities, and you are really looking at young adults that are getting ready to enter the workforce, invisible disabilities are the most prevalent, common amongst that group of students. So just keep that in mind if you are, employing younger professionals, going through your hiring process. That demographic group has been tracked in a very different way than older adults. So we have more information about younger adults specifically. And if you look at this slide specifically, it is challenging to read. You really focus on it, you can see the 50%, but that's just a good example of when we're talking about a barrier. It's not, a barrier doesn't mean that it's impossible to overcome and to meet your learning objective, but it's just more challenging. It takes more energy, more time, more focus. And it's unnecessary if you're keeping accessibility in mind. So 50% of students at four-year colleges do not score at the proficient level in literacy. Not high school. We're talking about students who have gone through high school and who have applied and been accepted and are actively in a four-year college. 50% of them have literacy challenges.
But we're not saying that's due to a disability necessarily, but it could be due to a disability, including an invisible one. So when we talk about, living with disabilities and accessibility, those factors come into play when we think about literacy. You don't necessarily have to recognize that there is a disability happening, someone's living with a disability within your staff or your learner audience. But this fact is kind of remains through that, right? That we have to identify that whether or not we have an awareness of a disability, there is still a shocking statistic here that literacy is prevalent as an issue, that professionals coming into the workforce may not be able to consume the information in a written form and act on it the way we wish them to, just based on the fact that a lot of professionals are seeing this as a challenge. Absolutely.
And I would just make the argument, not to get hung up on the notion of a disability when we're talking about accessibility, because we don't really need to understand why the issue is occurring, right? There could be a disability, there could be a reading issue, there could just be a gap in knowledge that was never closed as they were going through school. Regardless, as the person who is responsible for overseeing training for your learners, you need to keep that in mind, and you need to provide the types of learning experiences that are going to be accessible to everyone if you're going to get the return on that investment that you're hoping for.
So as always, are we going to be discussing some of those strategies today on how to navigate these challenges in training?
We're going to talk about a couple strategies, and really we hope to raise some awareness and open some doors for some conversation. So if you see some statistics in here, or if you have some takeaways and you want to follow up and have a more in-depth dive into kind of what are the strategies for overcoming some of the challenges of accessibility and e-learning, we're always happy to go through that with you. But today we're really focused on raising some awareness.
Yeah, and Emily, can you just take one quick second and talk a little bit about your personal expertise as it comes to literacy and reading abilities at every level?
Absolutely. So I'm a former school administrator and K-12 teacher, and my graduate degree was in literacy and secondary languages. So this is something that I'm particularly passionate about. I taught older students, I taught high school, and it amazed me. I worked with juniors and seniors most commonly, and the amount of students who were 18 years old, who were extremely intelligent, who were headed out the door to a four-year college, I knew because of my background in literacy that even they had some really significant deficits when it comes to literacy. And this is just something that we take for granted when we're looking at an adult learner. We're assuming that they have a mastery in reading, that they can read efficiently and proficiently. And in many cases, that might not be the case. And there's varying degrees to that, right? And I will say that in every place I have worked, I have identified high-functioning, educated adults that have severe deficiencies in literacy. And in every work environment I've had where training has occurred, there has been at least one individual from that establishment come in to my office, close the door, and say, can you help me with this? I can't do this training. I can't read.
Yeah, Emily and I were in a meeting just a couple weeks ago with a grade level building leader who shared a similar story, right? They said, we have a mandatory training that has to take place, and it was a support staff member, not a teaching staff member, but a support staff member that came to the school administrator and said just that. This training is mandatory, but I just can't get through it because I don't have the literacy skills to process the training and get the job done.
And that is a school, right? That is a group of professionals that are hyper aware of these kinds of issues. So imagine when you're talking about a business or a nonprofit, that level of awareness just isn't there in general.
And also that resource that professional would seek out within the organization, right? I mean, it's probably not very comfortable to be in a setting where you're not in a school and have this deficit and approach somebody about it.
Exactly. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of shame, and what I've also seen is there is a self-responsibility that those individuals feel like it is their problem. They're not going to raise their hand and tell you that they have challenges in this area, and so I would just encourage you to be sensitive to that and think about the type of training you're providing and whether or not the only way to access that information is by reading. So we talked about, there's different demographic groups that have been studied more prevalently because of our increased awareness as a society. So this is one stat that I don't think surprises anyone, right? 6.1 million children in the US are diagnosed with ADHD. That is almost 10% of the children right now. And while they are children, they are aging into the workforce. And so when we look forward, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years, these are the adult brains that are going to be processing information in professional roles and expected to act on it.
Yeah, so we have to recognize that and navigate that challenge in training, right?
Absolutely. So, where is the support? Like I said, we have a lot of good statistics on children, and they are aging into the workforce. So what does that actually look like? And on top of it, you don't have to have a disability to have an accessibility issue necessarily.
Yeah, being in educational technology, the tech itself oftentimes presents accessibility issues for individuals that don't have a mastery of utilizing or interfacing with technology. And I just have so many, stories to share that come to mind when teachers have pulled me aside after a training or after a PD session and said, I wasn't comfortable asking this in front of my peers, but I really need some individual support because I have an accessibility challenge with tech. And that's something that we continue to see today in adult workers.
Yeah, and I would encourage you, accessibility is a really loaded term, and we all have preconceived notions about what that means. But, just to share a personal anecdote, to my knowledge, I do not have a learning disability of any form. However, if you ask me to listen to information in isolation, if I don't have the ability to take notes, if there is no visual correlated with it, I struggle and my retention is very low. I don't like to listen to audiobooks. I have a hard time following a podcast if I actually have to absorb it and remember the information, right? So just keep that in mind. What, as a learner yourself, when have there been times where the way the information has been presented to you has made it more challenging and more difficult to absorb?
Yeah, this is one that I feel particularly passionate about, which is time completion. And does it really matter how long it takes for a task to get completed? And this is something that, organizationally and culturally, we have to process through within our organization. Really understanding the value of outcomes and expectations and the value of the work that needs to be completed.
Yeah, so when we will talk to organizations about their training, and oftentimes they already have some form of training and some form of exam or assessment or credentialing questionnaire that they have to do. And more often than not, those assessments are timed. And the first question I will really ask is, well, why are they timed? And what is that time based off of? And it's not because we believe that time is irrelevant and that everybody should have an unlimited amount of time to do everything, right? If you're talking about an assessment to be proficient and show that you can go fight a fire, that does need to be timed, right? But for many of the assessments that we come across that are correlated and part of an e-learning or just larger in-person training experience, oftentimes when we really dig into that, time isn't necessarily an important factor.
Or the biggest factor, right?
Right.
And oftentimes it's the only one we're looking at, right?
Exactly. So if there are 60 questions and you're giving your learner 60 minutes to complete it, well, maybe that is a reasonable amount of time. But like we just talked about, we know a large percentage of adults struggle with literacy. So that means you're going to have individuals taking assessments at different paces. It might take you 30 seconds to answer that question. It might take me 3 minutes.
Yeah. One of the things that has been a shift in professional development over the last few years is kind of this mantra of how much can you create, not how long can you sit, right? And so that's a difference even in in-person trainings, not just saying, okay, everybody got here on time, sat for 2 hours and has left. Let's start really digging into what can we make out of that time? What can we show and produce and use at a later date?
Absolutely. Yeah. And, taking into consideration too, how, as an adult learner, if somebody says to you, you have X amount of minutes to complete this, even if you don't necessarily, if you're not prone to anxiety or don't have issues feeling anxious, there is a level of anxiousness that is immediately instilled in most learners when they are given a time limit. So again, just something to think about as you're structuring and planning your trainings.
Yeah, so accessibility addresses disabilities, tools, and understanding. There's so much here to unpack when it comes to accessibility as it relates to disabilities. But as we have already talked about a few times, accessibility doesn't depend on a disability being present. So, we've talked about time and technology, literacy, but also cultural background. Those expectations and understanding of the context of the training, the application, all of these things can create accessibility challenges. And again, you don't have to be aware of the specifics that are taking place within your audience. One thing to keep in mind is that your training, especially e-learning, should persist through your current audience and be applicable to future learners you haven't yet met. So if we're crafting training that meets these needs, there's a good chance that you won't have to reinvest in solving or addressing some of these problems later on down the road. We build it initially with these things in mind. The training is more valuable and will last a longer amount of time, kind of to be used, again and again.
Absolutely. So compliance is the law, right? We know that if an individual on your team raises their hand and says, I have a disability, here's the documentation, and here's the accommodation I will need, we all know that we have to comply with that as long as it's a reasonable accommodation. But we're really striving to raise awareness, because the more accessible you make your training, the more efficient your learners are going to be able to complete that training, more approachable it will be for them. It truly does support all learners. And I'll give you kind of a good example of how something that is simple but has an enormous impact on the e-learning that we make for our clients, which is every time we put a video together or we have a voiceover narration of something inside of an e-learning, there's always closed captioning that goes with it. And if needed, we can also provide subtitles in other languages, right? That sounds like something that would be taken for granted, that, you just wouldn't even consider. But when you look at the e-learning that's available out in the world, it is not very common for that to be an offering. And even if you don't have someone who is hearing impaired necessarily, think about when you're talking about e-learners, they're typically doing the learning on their own in an asynchronous capacity. So think about the number of times you open up your laptop and the speakers don't work properly, or you want to complete the training, but you don't have your headphones with you, or maybe you have someone who just prefers to read and instead of, watching a video and listening. So when you think about like all of the challenges that can be associated by just providing that one extra piece of accessibility, whether or not there is a compliance piece to it, right? Whether or not you would argue you have to have it, it makes the training more accessible for everybody. So, and this is a little bit of my soapbox, but we talk about, when we talk about children as learners, and we talk about students in a K-12 capacity, there is just a different expectation, and there's a different tolerance for what we expect their experience to be. And we strive to make the world a little bit more dignified. And to us, that means using the same brain-based, research-based strategies that we are expecting our teachers to use when they're teaching our children. We believe in applying those same principles to adult learners.
Yeah, one of the things that has been really exciting that we've discovered really just over the last year is the progress and the tools that have been made available. Technology has come a far way in just the last year in stepping up to meet this challenge. When we talk about accessibility, we had done a lot of research the year before last trying to find tools that met our standards of accessibility, and it was really difficult to find them out there. One of the most exciting things that we're seeing, maybe it was related to COVID and the amount of remote learners and workers now, is that the tool set, the technology is really progressing to step up and meet this need. Emily talked about closed captioning, and one of the things that is now an option in like Google Meet and some of those other virtual meeting platforms is to turn on closed captioning in real time. And that's something you can do in Google Slides and some of those other tools. If you're presenting even in person, right? We're not even going to reach a remote audience. We can still turn on closed captioning for real-time in-person meetings. And so it's really exciting to see that big tech companies are stepping up to that challenge and producing tool sets that make the information more accessible for everybody.
Absolutely. So, like always, we believe in giving learners lots of options, lots of choices, and really what you find is when you're providing those choices, the learners will self-select the path that works for them. So, like if we're talking about closed captioning, learners will kind of default to watching the video or reading the text, and you don't even necessarily need to be aware that is occurring. But if you are providing them those choices, it will be a more positive experience. And learning can't really be joyful if you are just muddling through it. So give your learners the options they need. And as always, these are kind of our ongoing principles, and we're always happy to talk more deeply about them. But some of our non-negotiables that we think about when we design e-learning is, are we providing e-learning experiences that are consistent with different learning styles? Many times e-learning is composed of either talking head videos or PowerPoint voiceovers, maybe some multiple choice questions here and there.
We had just met with a subject matter expert yesterday who was struggling with getting into e-learning. And when we said, well, what types of content are you putting out? They said, well, I thought all I had to do was record myself on camera. And while that's not necessarily false, what we're suggesting here is that if you're only doing that, you're making it really difficult for the learner to absorb the information that they can best apply, right? You're creating a challenge for them in the learning process. And so we're just suggesting that, with accessibility as a challenge, we can step up just a little bit and adapt some of these strategies, apply them to the content you're already making, but companion that so that the learner has a little bit of choice in the way that they receive the information. You're going to go a little bit farther.
Absolutely. So we talked about closed captions. We talked about having a voiceover option if there is a text, for a text to be read aloud to a learner. It's also really important to provide a self-paced opportunity for the learner to absorb the information at the rate that they can. Just because it's a 20-minute start to finish training doesn't mean that every learner just needs 20 minutes to get all of that information. And learning cannot occur without accessibility. You might be able to provide a training and to check the box that says, yep, everybody went through and got their completion certificate. But if you're looking for behavior to change as a result of your training, learning has to occur. And every time you are presenting new information, you're asking your audience to learn. So just keep in mind, it's not about identification. It's not about trying to pinpoint which learners might have a disability or speculating on that. Quite the opposite. It's about providing the e-learning experience that meets the broadest spectrum of needs for your learners.
Yeah, and again, you want to create training that isn't tailored to your current audience necessarily, but persists through future learners, right? If you're creating an onboarding training, we have to make that work for everybody and make that as accessible as we can and as practical as we can so that your training is good for your current audience and future learners as well.
Absolutely. These are our 6 pillars. We have, like Matt said, we've talked about respect. We are talking about accessibility today, but we have resources on our website that cover all 6 of these and walk you through just questions to consider. And next time we're talking about customization when it comes to training, which is very exciting because that's what we do. That's at the heart of what we believe every e-learning experience should be.
So absolutely, as always, we invite you to check us out at dignifiedlearning.com and take advantage of the free resources that are there. We've got some great resources that are relevant to previous topics, but also today's subject as well. And so we love to give away as much as we can for free so that you can show up in the world and make your learning experiences more dignified.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time.